Hello. Happy New Year. Thank you for joining us on today, our very first program of 2024. My name is Olivia Mattis, and on behalf of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, I would like to welcome you all. You saw a very important film, Who Will Write Our History? And now you're in for a very important talk. That it doesn't support the film, it's its own thing. It puts the film in a much larger context. Dr. Jud Newborn will take you on a tour of rescue and resistance during World War II. He normally calls his talk the Lion of Judah or Lions of Judah to talk about Jewish courage and help to fortify you. And boy, do we need to be fortified in these days. I want to mention that Dr. Jud Newborn is even better in person than he is on Zoom. So if you represent a synagogue or a community center or a group of any kind that brings in speakers, I do urge you to consider inviting Dr. Jud Newborn, and we will put his direct email address into the chat box so that you can reach out to him. Now, I'm delighted that today I have not one but two dear friends sharing the podium. In addition to Dr. Jud Newborn, we have Dr. Shulamit Reinhartz, who will be your moderator today. She's going to gather your questions. She's going to introduce our speaker, and she will be the mistress of ceremony. So without further ado, Dr. Reinhartz, Shula, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia. When you said I'm not the mistress of ceremonies, it just reminded me that I once had that role. And I began the evening by saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I am your mistress." And then I was quiet, and it sort of got us off on a good start. I don't think we need that for today because this is going to be a marvelous program. One of the geniuses of Olivia Mattis and the Sousa Mendes Foundation is to pair films with speakers so that you can hear what the person says and you can see what other people have done with that topic. And that is true of Jud Newborn, Dr. Jud Newborn. There could be no better speaker on that film than he. I want to tell you that he is a person with two different areas of specialization. He's an anthropologist, which looks at people moving around in what they call the field. And he's also an historian, which can't really look at people moving around because they're usually dead. So he gets the present and the past nicely joined. He has a degree from the very prestigious University of Chicago. The PhD is in anthropology with distinction, and he tells us that very few people graduate with distinction. So it was a good thing they got around to Jud. One of the great things that he has done is to become a supporter and an activist in the solidarity movement in Poland. And Jud and others have just told me that nobody was going to know what that is. But I think this is a very intelligent audience. If you have heard of the solidarity movement, could you raise your hand? Excellent. You get an A, all of you. The rest, I don't know. So the solidarity movement was a Polish movement headed by Lech Walesa, which was right. Judy Landau is nodding her head. And he participated not as an historian, but as an activist anthropologist who actually participated in the underground. The other thing I want to tell you, two other things I want to tell you about Jud. He is the world expert on the White Rose movement. Could those of you who are able to raise your hand and have heard of it, could you please raise your hand if you have heard of it? Okay, so we have a man who really has studied the White Rose and has studied and participated in the solidarity movement. He's a person who knows what he's talking about when he talks about resistance. The other thing I want to say is, how many people have heard of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City? Okay, so that's a museum which takes the story of the Holocaust into the present and the nearby past by talking about Jewish life that emerged from the Holocaust. And he was the founding historian at that museum. So without spending my time talking about all of his other accomplishments, I think this gives you an overview of what he's all about. And now we have Jud in person. He is this man with Barbara Stanwyck's picture next to him up there. That's how you can tell who that is. And we are so excited that you are here. You raised your hand, that's because you know who you are?
Yeah, I figured it out.
Okay, so why don't you share your wisdom, your insights with our chat group and our audience today. Dr. Jud Newborn.
Well, Shulamit, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction and very charming introduction, I must say. And I want to tell you that what a pleasure it is that we're working together on this program today. Your background is marvelous, and everyone should look up and see what you're about, although I think you've done this before. And some of the audience should know who Shulamit Reinhardt is.
If you know who I am, please raise your hand. Very good.
Well, we have much in common as scholars and in terms of our interests and our personal backgrounds. So without more ado, let me launch into this story, which is jam-packed, and let's begin. Most of you have seen the documentary, Who Will Write Our History? It's about the code name Oyneg Shabbos, or Joy of Sabbath project in the Warsaw Ghetto, led by the historian Dr. Emanuel Ringelblum. Its purpose was to secretly record every aspect of life under the Nazis, using every medium possible, seen through a Jewish lens, not the distorted one of the Nazis. They did so in the desperate hope that the world after the war would discover the buried archive and learn the truth about Jewish oppression, suffering, and resilience. It is, in fact, one of the greatest achievements of the human spirit. It also shows us that Jewish resistance took not one, but many overlapping forms, from hiding one's family away to maintaining the Jewish spirit and identity through secret religious and cultural practices, to creating everything from soup kitchens to secret lending libraries, to children smuggling food through the ghetto walls, to undergrounds that distributed news to cut off populations and organize resistance, and finally to not just one or two famous cases, but multiple forms of armed resistance itself. Today, I'm going to provide you with a broader context so we can understand the obstacles Jews had to overcome to survive, much less resist, and then launch into the accounts of actual armed resistance efforts throughout Europe and North Africa. Okay, we're about to hear the anthem of the Jewish partisans who fought in the forests during the Holocaust.
Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg, wenn Himmeln bleiene verstellen bläue Tag, weil kommen wird noch unser Haus gebänkte Schau, uns wird abhäutern unser Trott, wir seien da. Sag nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg, wenn Himmeln bleiene verstellen bläue Tag, weil kommen wird noch unser Haus gebänkte Schau, uns wird abhäutern unser Trott, wir seien da. Von grünem Palmenland bis weitem Land und Schnee, wir seien Dom in unser Wein, in unser Weg, und wo gefallen ist der Spott von unser Blut, denn doch er spott von unser Krone und der Mut.
This Yiddish song, Sog nicht keinmal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg, Never Say You Were on Your Last Road was written in the spring of 1943 by Hirsch Glick of the Vilna Ghetto, inspired by news of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. It became the anthem of Jewish anti-Nazi partisans. An example of spiritual resistance, it has been sung ever since to honor them and all Jewish freedom fighters. Here's a free translation of that first verse, one that rhymes in English. Never say that you have reached the very end, when leaden skies a bitter future may portend, because the hour that we fight for soon is near. Beneath our tread the earth shall tremble. We are here. These are not the nihilistic words of fanatical would-be martyrs like Hamas, with no concern or genuine vision for the future of the people they supposedly represent. It is a song of humanity and resolve, a song that affirms life despite the tremendous odds. We were here. We are here. Now, decades ago, when I first discovered the little-known but stirring story of the German White Rose anti-Nazi resistance, about which I also lecture, it strongly primed me to reconsider the presuppositions that I had grown up with about the seemingly passive Jewish response to Nazi oppression. And that took me back to earliest childhood. I remember one day in Brooklyn, digging through my grandmother's chest of drawers. I was perhaps 5 years old at the time, and discovering hidden under a blanket, a pile of blankets, an enigmatic photograph of family members she had left behind in Kremenets in the Ukraine. The photograph was printed in sepia on thick cardboard with people posed in 3 rows, grandparents, parents, a boy and a girl. Excited, I ran to my grandmother. "Who are they, Grandma?" I asked. "Don't ask me," she said in her warm Yiddish accent, turning away, her face red with pain. "Hitler burnt them all." Suddenly, the bright eyes of those in the photograph seemed to be burning holes through the cardboard, and for the first time in my own young life, a hole opened in my gut that smoldered and burned. This photo connected me personally to those impersonal yet excruciating images that came to define the world's vision of European Jewry after the war. You know the ones I mean. Jews huddled naked beside ditches, awaiting their executioner's machine gun bullets, or marching quietly to their death by gassing. But years later, during my research on resistance for New York's Museum of Jewish Heritage, I came across a very different family photo which a cousin had, looking very much like this one. My cousin kept it, but this one is a picture, a picture of my grandmother's nephew, my cousin Sholem, sitting with high spirits on the steps of the Zionist Youth Center in Kremenets before the war. Intrigued, I learned a story the Nazis had never wanted us to know. Led by these youths, the Jew of Kremenets met their SS murderers with pitchforks and crowbars, setting fire to their own ghetto and fleeing into the woods, only to be captured and machine-gunned by the SS and their local Ukrainian henchmen. What this discovery brought home to me was just how much the history of the Holocaust was not something simple and straightforward, but a struggle by Jews for truth and meaning, for memory itself. This is because the Nazis attempted to dispose not only over the bodies of their Jewish victims, but over the very fact of genocide, over history itself. They did this by distorting the meaning of their acts or by expunging the traces of their crimes altogether. Listen now to Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, mastermind of the final solution, addressing SS officers in Posen, occupied Poland, on October 6, 1943. "I am referring to the clearing out of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish race. Most of you know what it means when 100 corpses are lying side by side, or 500, or 1,000. To have stuck it out and at the same time, apart from exceptions caused by human weakness, to have remained decent, anständig. This is what has made us hard. This is a page of glory in our history which has never been written and must never be written." Well, in response to this terrifying attempt by the Nazis to control history and memory, Jews throughout Europe felt a growing, desperate compulsion to bear witness, however they might. Listen to the teacher Chaim Kaplan in his Warsaw Ghetto diary, which he smuggled out before perishing in Treblinka. "In the spiritual state like the one in which I find myself at this time, it is difficult to hold a pen, to concentrate one's thoughts. But a strange idea has stuck in my head since the war broke out, that it is a duty I must perform. This idea is like a flame imprisoned in my bones, burning within me, screaming, record! For those in the concentration and death camps, this fear of being eliminated from memory was even more horrifying. The words of a survivor: "The SS guards took pleasure in telling us that we had no chance of coming out alive, a point they emphasized with particular relish by insisting that after the war, the rest of the world would not believe what happened. There would be rumors, speculation, but no clear evidence, and people would conclude that evil on such a scale was just not possible." And so one of the 4 Auschwitz Sonderkommando, or special squads, those slaves responsible for cremating their own brethren before being consigned themselves every 3 months to the flames, bore witness by actually stuffing manuscripts in bottles and burying them like desperate messages amid the sea of ashes of the crematoria grounds, hoping that someday they might come to the surface, wash ashore. "Dear finder," one of them said in Yiddish, "search everywhere, in every inch of soil. Tens of documents are buried under it, mine and those of other persons. Great quantities of teeth are also buried here. It is we, the crematoria workers, who expressly have strewn them all over the terrain, as many as we could, so that the world should find material traces of the millions of murdered people. We ourselves have lost all hope of being able to see the moment of liberation. It is for this reason that we too must bear witness. We must seize back history from the Nazis and repossess the meaning of the Holocaust itself, while securing it against those who would deny it. Before I launch into the details of resistance, I need somehow to convey to you just how desperate the conditions of Jews were and how unique the obstacles were which they had to overcome. That way we'll be able to understand just how extraordinary their accomplishments were when they managed, despite everything, to resist. One way to do this is to talk about hiding. Now, some people presume that hiding oneself away from the Nazis was somehow passive or even shameful. But hiding was actually an act of defiant self-preservation, a necessary step on the route to more active resistance. It was a step open to only a few, and one that required tremendous self-discipline and creativity. After all, how was one to procure food regularly, especially in times of rationing? And in a world full of treachery, upon whom could one depend for help? Those in hiding also had to keep shifting hiding places somehow so as not to be found out. Now, there were some Gentiles who helped Jews out of humanitarianism, and the SS were not above hanging a pole in the town square as an object lesson to its countrymen not to help Jews. Today, we honor these wonderful people at Yad Vashem as the righteous among the nations, and often find they are humble. They consider their altruism obvious and ordinary, which makes them all the more remarkable. But many others helped Jews out of greed. Should a Jewish family run out of money, the Gestapo was always ready to offer mercenaries and informers a quart of brandy, several pounds of sugar, or a carton of cigarettes. This was the price of a Jewish life. As for those Jews who did manage to find hiding places, what did one do in spaces where there were no indoor toilets, there was scant air, where there were newborn infants to care for, or when a doctor was needed? Yes, hiding required tremendous resourcefulness, and so throughout Europe, hiding became an art. Jews sometimes lived for years behind double walls and hanging ceilings, or in camouflaged attics and cellars, or in pits dug under the floorboards of barns. They hid themselves in pigsties, cowsheds, and stables. There are even cases in Eastern Europe of Jews being concealed inside haystacks and even in bunkers dug beneath cemetery tombs. Some Jews in hiding hid in places so narrow that they had to take turns lying down. There are even 2 documented cases of Jews hiding in the dark filth of pigeon coops beneath the racks of roosting birds. And then, when I thought I'd heard everything, a film was released in 2012 called No Place on Earth. It tells how 5 families of 38 people from ages 2 to 75 survived underground in a deep Ukrainian cave system for more than 500 days, and despite Ukrainian anti-Semites trying to cave in the entrance. In some cities, Jews even struggled to survive in dank sewer tunnels, like the family and friends of Ignat Shiger, in Lviv. At one point, they almost all drowned after being trapped in a storm basin during a thunderstorm, with water coming up to their nostrils. One mother accidentally smothered her infant, whose cries throughout the gateway threatened to give them all away. At the war's end, they finally emerged like creatures from another planet, in rags and covered with mud, their vision blurred from the many months they had spent underground. As for children, some were hidden in baking stoves or garbage bins. One of our first Holocaust scholars, Philip Friedman, saw with his own eyes a child who had been concealed in a box that in turn had been hidden within a gloomy storeroom. The child's muscles were so atrophied he could not walk. And like a fish that had lived too long within a cave, he was almost blind. As for his voice, he could only make senseless utterances, having never learned the art of speech. But hiding could also be an integral part of armed resistance. For example, in Warsaw, while putting down the ghetto uprising, SS Major General Jürgen Stroop was amazed to discover a complex system of 631 bunkers, which Jews had been building for months as part of their evolving resistance plan. Many were connected by tunnels and hooked up surreptitiously to water and electrical sources. And then there were one of the most unique and inspiring places of shelter, the Jewish family camps, hidden deep within the Eastern European forests and swamps. Since the Nazis had concentrated Jewish families in order to annihilate them in their entirety, Jewish partisans countered this diabolical policy by setting up as many as 20 secret camouflaged camps, like the Bielski brothers' New Jerusalem, which they used as bases and defended, populated by those who could not fight, especially Jewish children and the elderly, whom the partisans had refused to abandon. The Bielski brothers' story and the veritable village of 800 people they built was finally told in the film Defiance in 2008. As these last examples tell us, the Jewish struggle against the Nazis was by no means limited to hiding. In fact, contrary to popular assumptions that Jews went to their death as sheep, there were far more varieties and instances of armed Jewish resistance than most of us are aware. Now, although the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt was timed to Passover with its theme of liberation from slavery, the holiday that was actually foremost in the minds of Jewish freedom fighters was not so much Passover as Hanukkah, for obvious reasons. The Maccabees' valiant armed revolt in 167 BCE, and the oil, the miracle that lasted not 1 day but 8. They lived together thereafter for 100 years in their own kingdom. And in fact, it took the Roman Empire 5 years and 4 full legions in 71 CE to put down the revolt of those same stubborn provincial Hebrews, a campaign so important that the emperor created the Arch of Titus in the Roman Forum, using enslaved Jewish labor, just to commemorate this hardest-won victory. And the Jews revolted yet again 60 years later in 132 CE under their leader Bar Kokhba, their heroism lasting 4 years until ending tragically in the total devastation and their involuntary dispersal from Palestine. And so it is fitting that if one lit a Hanukkah candle for every significant act of Jewish resistance that occurred during the Holocaust, one would exhaust the entire box long before coming to the end of the list. For this reason, I have grouped the specific forms of active resistance into 8 candles. Let's light them now together figuratively in order to round out our story. The first candle is for those Jews who resisted in Germany itself, despite Gestapo surveillance and imposed yellow stars, despite the complacency, fear, or hostility of those around them, which reduced even non-Jewish resistance into tragically circumscribed acts of courage. Like this candle especially for 27 young Zionists and left-wing activists in the Herbert Baum group, who set fire to one of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' major exhibitions in Berlin on May 15, 1942, only to be captured, tried, and brutally executed, many by guillotine. The oldest among their number was 30, the youngest a girl of 19. Meanwhile, there was both the spiritual and covert resistance of the Hug Halutzi, a Zionist group led by the heroic 19-year-old gay resistance operative Gad Beck, who risked their lives in Berlin by sneaking into the Grunewald forest at night on Shabbat, using a flashlight for the ritual Havdalah candle marking the division of night and day, and fragrant crushed leaves to smell in place of the traditional spices. The next two candles are for the many Jews who fought, often as leaders, in the so-called non-Jewish European undergrounds, from the nationalist to communist. Candle number 2 is for the 2,000 guerrillas of the Armée Juive, who claimed over 1,900 actions in France, including the demolition of 32 Nazi factories and 750 acts of railway sabotage. 1,000 of them, fully one half of their number, were killed. Like this candle also for the 390 Jewish insurgents, practically the entire French resistance force of 400, who, led by José Abulker, tied down 11,000 enemy troops, thereby participating decisively in the Allied capture of Algiers in Operation Torch on November 8, 1942, and in turn ushering in the Allied defeat of Rommel in North Africa and saving the 117,000 Jews of Algeria alone. The third candle is for 14 of the Italian partisan units named for Jewish fighters, and for the great right of Primo Levi, who was a partisan before being captured and sent to Auschwitz, and for Chaim Vito Volterra and his Monte San Martino unit, which provides the only case of any partisans of any background attacking and liberating Jews from a concentration camp, the transit camp Cervigliano. This candle is also for Rita Rosani, killed in action on Rosh Hashanah of 1944 at age 24, and the only woman to receive posthumously an Italian military gold medal. 2,000 of the 27,000 Jews left in Germany, in Italy, occupied by Germany, were partisans. If there is still time before the candle burns down, at least mention the only deportation train to Auschwitz to be stopped anywhere in Europe by 3 members of the valiant Jewish Defense Committee of Belgium. It departed the Mechelen transit camp the night of April 19, 1943. Along with the help of the train's Belgian engineer, who kept the train moving as slowly as possible, ultimately 233 were able to escape, of whom 119 survived. Of course, there's no photo of that, but this photo of a similar transport helps bring it to life. You know, the grandparents of the Sousa Mendes Foundation's president, Olivia Mattis, were among the leaders of the Jewish Defense Committee of Belgium. So, when you think or learn about the European national undergrounds in future, like the famous French Maquis, don't presume, as many do, that they were without Jews. To the contrary, Jews were overrepresented in all of these undergrounds and crucial to their operations. Now, to understand how to evaluate the accomplishments of Jewish resistance in Eastern Europe, where the majority of Jews lived, we need to do some context setting and comparisons. All European undergrounds received substantial support from the Allies and their own countrymen, without which they could not have continued. Just to give you an example, in Poland alone, the Polish army, and of course Jews had no army, prior to its defeat, hid away many thousands of weapons, including 566 heavy machine guns, 32,000 rifles, 28 anti-tank guns, and over 5 million bullets. They also received nearly 900 supply drops from Allied aircraft, as well as hundreds of parachute-dropped reinforcements to train commandos and help prepare forest bases. Here is a map showing only select resistance sites of Jews. The Jews for whom the 4th Hanukkah candle is lit received gar nichts, as we say in Yiddish, or next to nothing. Despite outright refusal by national groups to arm the Jews, despite a civilian Jewish population weakened by surprise deportation raids, disease, and near starvation, the Jewish youth movements from across the political spectrum worked to organize secret resistance groups in the ghettos of Białystok, Częstochowa, and Krakow, where armed revolts all took place. They were also facilitated by daring young female couriers who ventured in disguise beyond the ghetto walls to connect those groups otherwise totally cut off from one another, smuggling in vital news and ammunition. At times, Jews even rose as a mass in Nischwitz, mounting a Bren gun on the synagogue and opening fire on the German lorries. In Tuchsin, in Lachva, and yes, my grandmother's own town of Kremenetz, as I told you earlier, meeting their tormentors with pitchforks and burning their own ghetto in a desperate attempt to escape the inevitable slaughter. that awaited them. Light this fourth candle, then, for the underground organizations and the attempts at armed acts of resistance in over 100 ghettos, from Western Poland to Belarus. And we have only 4 candles left. Candle number 5 is a very special one. It commemorates the most famous revolt of all, forced on the Germans at the height of Nazi power, and while the nearest friendly front lines manned by the Soviet army were still 1,200 kilometers away. This rebellion, the first to occur in any occupied city in Europe, took place while the surrounding national underground stood watching, having grudgingly supplied the embattled Jewish freedom fighters with only a handful of old pistols and attack grenades from their tremendous store of heavy weapons that lay idle in secret local warehouses. Meanwhile, just outside the ghetto walls, in sight of the plumes of smoke from burning buildings, a Lenten carnival played on, complete with a merry-go-round and tightrope walkers. Even though this photo was taken through a supposedly triumphant German lens, still the dignity of these captured Jewish freedom fighters shines through. 5 days after the struggle, the leaders of the Jewish Fighting Organization issued a radio message of heartfelt fraternal greetings to their countrymen. A battle is being waged, they proclaimed, for your freedom as well as ours. And true to their word, the scarred Jewish remnant crawled out of still smoking bunkers 1 year later, or from hiding places on the Aryan side, to join in the ill-fated citywide uprising their own actions had inspired. Yes, we light our 5th candle for the young leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto revolt, who kept the Nazis at bay for a month, longer than had several sovereign European nations. Candle number 6 is for the tens of thousands of Jewish partisans in the Eastern European forests and marshes, who, well out of proportion to the size of the total population, blew up numerous railway installations and Nazi police and army posts, even while avoiding the German units sent to wipe them out, the occasional bullets of anti-Semitic members of non-Jewish partisan groups, and frequent betrayal by local peasants. At its start, between 1942 and 1943, some estimate that Jews made up as many as 1/2 of all partisans in Polish forests. There were an estimated 30,000 Jews in the Soviet partisan movement once it got organized. One of them was photographer Faye Schulman, who managed to retrieve her hidden camera and tripod from the ghetto where she had hidden it before escaping. "I want people to know that there was resistance," she said after the war. "I have pictures. I have proof." This candle is also for the Soviet Army's Lithuanian division, which was so overwhelmingly Jewish that orders were often given, yes, in Yiddish. And it is for the 32 Palestinian Jewish parachutists, like the young poet Hannah Senesh, whom the British only grudgingly agreed to drop back into Eastern Europe out of a total of 240 eager volunteers, even making them sign a pledge first not to focus specifically on organizing Jewish resistance. Of course, they ignored that. Now, you might be wondering why the candles I use are green, as you saw earlier. Well, when I was working at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, I met a modest and wonderful diminutive Jewish woman, Chaya Palevsky. Chaya was in the Vilna ghetto as a girl, forced to sort through clothing that had been brought in. When her little sister was deported for so-called resettlements at a place called Ponar, Chaya gave her a pretty white blouse on which she'd embroidered colorful little flowers. Not long after, she found that same blouse in a pile of clothing that had been returned to Vilna, and now she knew her sister had been murdered. That very night, Chaya put on that blouse herself and escaped to join partisans in the forest. And when that blouse got torn, she mended it with parachute silk. And when it became dirty, she scrubbed it in the white ashes of the campfires. Chaya donated that blouse to the museum. No matter how hard it was to survive in the forest, she told me, at least we were free of that stinking ghetto. So my green candles are for her and all those who sought shelter in the forests and used it as a base for resistance. And now we come to our 7th and penultimate candle for the Jews of the deportation trains and the 6 death camps, weakened, deceived, and with children, or the elderly in their arms. Some might find it presumptuous to expect resistance. After all, non-Jewish concentration camp inmates, including as many as 5 million trained Soviet soldiers in innumerable concentration and POW camps, behaved no differently and launched almost no significant resistance. And yet here, within the darkest chambers of Nazi devising, the impossible happened. And not just once, but 3 times, in Sobibor, time to Sukkot, and led by the Jewish Soviet officer Alexander Pechorsky, where at least 10 Nazi officers were killed with hatchets before inmates broke out to join the partisans. And in Treblinka, where the fuel tanks were blown sky high and a mass escape ensued. And even in Auschwitz-Birkenau on October 7th, 1944, against the wishes of the mixed international camp underground who said it was too soon, where guards were attacked and the crematorium number 4 out of all 4 of them set afire. Who did it? It was those same men I told you about earlier, the crematorium workers who buried those manuscripts in bottles amidst the ash. So for those who fought in the death camps against all odds, light Hanukkah candle number 7. Armed resistance gives us pride, but it seems fitting as we come to a conclusion to emphasize the importance of spiritual resistance. For example, by celebrating Hanukkah in camps and ghettos. And who can forget Anne Frank's family singing Ma'o Tzur as they lit their candles in hiding? And then we come back to the extraordinary Oyneg Shabbos archive with these amazing photos of some of the buried archival cans and cases from 2 caches being recovered after the war, some 6,000 documents, even though all but 3 of the 60 citizen historians who compiled them perished, and a 3rd cache was never recovered. If under the thick layer of ash our life is not extinguished, Abraham Levin said in a preserved literary evening speech, this will prove a triumph of the human over the inhuman, that our will to live is stronger than the German will to annihilate us. Or in Auschwitz-Birkenau itself, where inmates helped one another observe mitzvahs, ritual commandments, like the Zarchiver Hasidic Rebbe, who at great risk to his own life managed somehow to bake matzah just before Passover 1944, which he shared. Or the starving women who would take a half-rotten potato they longed to eat, but instead would scoop out 2 holes, filling them with rancid margarine, and making wicks from their prison garments so as to light Shabbos candles. Now, as much as they wanted to live, the Jews who opted for resistance had no false hopes of salvation. The only encouragement they could offer one another was an ethic of action in the face of almost certain death, a way not of putting out the flames, but of walking through them. But there were many more than one way of walking through those flames. Marek Edelman, himself a surviving Warsaw Ghetto freedom fighter until his death in 2009, explained the courage of those who took this more common route. Those people went quietly and with dignity, he said. It is a horrendous thing when one is going so quietly to one's death. It is infinitely more difficult than to go out shooting. Many of these Jews did not assume that posture of dignity for reasons as paltry as personal honor. Facing the inevitable, they appropriated the moment of their death to the sanctity of their own Jewish freedom-loving values, with the Marseillaise, HaTikva, or the Shema on their lips, and went in the spirit of Kiddush Hashem, in the name of God. For them, let us all, Jew and non-Jew, light the 8th and last candle. Adolf Hitler once said derisively that conscience is a Jewish invention. Hitler was referring to Judaism's gift to the world, the moral basis of Western civilization, the 10 Commandments, which he thought a Jewish ploy to weaken non-Jews and render them vulnerable to exploitation. Instead, we can draw inspiration from the Jews who defied the Nazis, whether spiritually or through armed action or by simply surviving. they did so under conditions of unimaginable extremity, and yet never taking innocent civilian lives. Nothing could make clearer the difference between the nihilistic fanaticism and gleeful bloodthirst of terrorists like Hamas and Hezbollah, and that of true courage. Despite the near certainty of death, the Jewish partisans, through the lyrics of their anthem, with which we will conclude, remind us of this lesson, which is not just for Jews, but for all humanity, if they will only listen. Never say that you have reached the very end, when leaden skies a bitter future may portend, because the hour we have hungered for is near. Because our tread the earth shall tremble. We are here.
Das Lied geschrieben ist mit Blut und nicht mit Blei. Es ist nicht kein Lied von a Fegeläuf der frei. Das hat a Volk zwischen fallende gewählt. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Hand. Das hat a Volk zwischen fallende gewählt. Das Lied gesungen mit Naganes in die Hand. Das sag nicht kein Mal, als du gehst dem letzten Weg. Wenn Himmeln bleien, verstellen blaue Tage. Kommen wir durch unser ausgebänkte Schor. Es wird abbeugt an unser Trotz, wir sind durch. Kommen wir durch unser ausgebänkte Schor. Es wird abbeugt an unser Trotz, wir sind durch.
Thank you, Jud, for such a heartfelt and important presentation. And we'll get to audience questions in just a few minutes, moderated by Dr. Shulamit Reinhardt. So while I'm making my announcements, this is your moment to continue putting your questions. I know you have many questions into that chat box. So what a way to start out our 2024 season with this amazing lecture. In 2 weeks, we have our next program, and that has to do with the escape of German Jews, Hans and Margaret Ray, writers of Curious George. You are familiar with the book that was written on the topic by Louise Borden, and now we're showing the filmed version of that called Monkey Business. We'll show you the trailer in a minute for that film. Our other February program is 2 weeks after that, and that's on the Dutch resistance heroine, Honey Schaft. She was known as the girl with the red hair. She dyed her hair black during the war so as not to be found out, but someone betrayed her when they saw the red roots of her hair, and she was killed at the young age of 24. So we bring you all kinds of heroes, some of whom you've heard about and others of whom are new to you. And we hope that all of these stories are meaningful. After today's program, as usual, you'll be getting a note about how to sign up for those and other programs. And I also want to mention something else. We have created this amazing education in a box, and it's the Heroes of the Holocaust Rescuer playing cards. I'm just going to show you a few of the cards here. So let me show you this card on our hero, Aristides de Souza Mendes. He's the Ace of Hearts, of course. The King of Hearts is Nicholas Winton. There's a new film out about Nicholas Winton that I would love to present to you. And then bringing us back to the Warsaw Ghetto, we have Irena Sendler, our Queen of Hearts. And we have 52 heroic stories in this pack of cards for you to offer to all the young people in your life. And there's even a little original essay by our resident historian, Dr. Mordechai Paldiel. One of the cards is actually on both sides a little synopsis on who these heroes are and why it's important to know about them and remember them. So now we're going to see a little trailer of our upcoming film called Monkey Business.
Everybody thinks Curious George is such an American icon, and of course he is. But he was created by German Jews who lived in Paris, took him through Brazil, and then brought him to the United States. So he's as much of an immigrant as anyone. There are George's adventures, but then there are the Ray's adventures.
Okay, so now let me turn the floor over to Dr. Reinhard Shulamit. Take it away.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jud, for that amazing presentation and for your honest expression of emotion. It was very important, I think, for all of us to see that we're not only talking about ideas, but about very profound feelings. So I have the list of questions here. And one of the things that dominates the comments is praise for you, Jud.
Oh,
What a brilliant and impassioned talk. Thank you.
oh.
That's from Carol Kornreich. Here's a question that I think might have made other people curious. You told us that the Onyx Shabbos materials were in batches, and that the third batch has not been found. And
Yes.
Darrell Smith asks you, are there any plans to really work on locating the third batch, perhaps under the embassy?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, it's said that the third cache of hidden documents is under what is now the Chinese embassy in Warsaw.
Mhm.
I believe in 2005, there was an effort to look for it. And you can, of course, look at the information connected with the film. I think it may tell you that. I know of no plans right now to try and find it. I think it's quite amazing that any of them were found, and they were only found because Rochel Auerbach, one of the few surviving citizen historians, knew where to look. So it's amazing that we have the two. Of course, it would be tremendous to have this third one.
There's another person on listening in, Joan Kretschmer, who asked basically the same question, but she also said, is someone blocking the search?
I don't know. I can't answer that, but I have to say that I would find it very hard to believe that the Poles would block it because however complicated Polish-Jewish relations have been over the years, they do have the Warsaw Historical Institute there, and they have documented Jewish resistance, and they often call it Polish patrimony, and they take some pride in it.
Diane writes, how can I possibly begin to educate a close friend who, ignorantly, questions why the Jews didn't resist? This is constantly on my mind. I don't know how to start. Books, documents, films, transcripts. I cannot let this go. I have something that might help you, Diane. And that is, it's just some numbers. When the Holocaust started, or which is also a debate about what are the dates of it, but let's say from 1933 on, when Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany, from that date on, on that date, there were 9.5 million Jews in Europe. 9.5 million Jews in Europe. At the end of the war, 6 million approximately perished. And even if you're not a math whiz, you can probably figure out that 3.5 million did not perish. The question is, how did these people not perish? You can't say they didn't perish because they found refuge in other countries. That almost never happened. The 3.5 people who did not perish were able to retain their lives because they resisted. They resisted in all sorts of ways, and I completely agree with Dr. Newborn that hiding is a very important form of resistance. And if you're a person who likes data, there's a lot of data about how effective hiding was. It was the most effective way in Holland to survive.
And not
And the fact that we had Anne Frank so firmly ensconced in our heads, and she was captured, does not undermine the fact that she stayed alive for quite a while in the hiding place. So when you resist and when you hide, for example, it doesn't mean you will definitely survive, but it means you resisted and you were alive for a while. And it's those people who are the more likely to survive than anybody else. So your friend is just mathematically incorrect, Diane. And if you want to, you can tell her to email me. My email is reinhartz@brandeis.edu. Did you want to say something, Jud?
Yeah, I would like to say first to Diane that this program is going to be on YouTube. So all you have to do is tell your friend that if she doesn't look at this program on YouTube, then she has no right to make any comments anymore about anything relating to the Holocaust. Yes, have her look at this program and have everybody, anyone who thinks they know people who don't know anything, or people who have questions about this subject matter of resistance, I think you should share this program. And I want to tell you that from the very beginning that I started doing this kind of program, which began many, many years ago, when I started, the Jews created different kinds of organizations of Jewish partisans, Jewish resistance fighters. They published voluminous documentation in volumes after volumes that were, done in an amateurish way because they were not official historians. However, they were always told that they were apologists, that they were telling things that were not really documented or true. It was so hard to get through the image of Jews as passively going to their deaths and the image and the image of the vast Nazi onslaught. And so they struggled and they were deeply, deeply frustrated. I have done this in this lecture many, many years ago when people would say to me, well, that's all nice, but it's like a mosquito biting an elephant. And
Not true.
And I said, you're not paying attention. I gave you context. I explained to you why there were obstacles that nobody else in Europe faced. And on and on and on. But there were people who still have these presuppositions of Jews as passive victims. And non-Jews, I think, also think of Jews essentially as victims. Of course, they were victims during the Holocaust. But the point is that robs any possibility of understanding Jewish agency despite the most extreme conditions that they had to overcome. So, and also scholarship has become ever more thorough in examining this. So there's plenty of books, there's plenty of solid scholarship. If somebody wants to know, they can go to the library, and they can also Google. Anybody, including your friend, who wants to know something about Jewish resistance, all she has to do is Google.
I would like to add something to what you said, Jud, which is that if people think that Jews went to their deaths like sheep, they are mouthing what the Nazis were saying about Jews.
Right.
That's what the Nazis want us to believe.
Right.
So just saying it is you're being complicit with the explicit effort of the Nazis to create this notion of this helpless Jews. That's one of the reasons they have so many films about that topic.
Right. Also, in relation to that, the whole notion of Jews, the phrase Jews going as lambs to the slaughter, that was actually coined, or it was said by Abba Kovner, one of the leading partisans from the Vilna Ghetto in the forest, who said to people to rouse them, let us not go as lambs to slaughter. He didn't say we are going as lambs to slaughter. And he launched the most extraordinary resistance efforts, and then he survived and went to Israel, and he helped form the Kibbutz Lochamai HaGetaot, which is the Ghetto Fighters Museum and Kibbutz in Israel, which is dedicated to documenting resistance. So the phrase itself has been misconstrued from the beginning.
Now I'm going to say something that's controversial. which is when the Jews were attempting to put the Holocaust experience into words after the shooting stopped. They used the word zachor, which everybody knows means remember. Remembering is an obligation. It's a mitzvah in terms of the Holocaust. So you could say to your friend that she is doing precisely what the Jews of the Holocaust did not want anyone to do. That's one thing. But the other thing is, I really think a lot about, is zachor really the single word, the most important idea with regard to the Holocaust? And I think by saying zachor, which is remember, we are not focusing on the most important thing, which is resist. It's because people resisted that we had 3.5 million Jews to get started again and to have the state of Israel. But our resistance is a characteristic of our nature. That's the whole Jew. How do you think Jewish people have survived over 2,000 years? Because people were resisting all the time. But what do we read? We read about the suffering of the Jews. I agree that we must know that, but we have to know two other things. One is we resisted, and two is that non-Jewish people helped us. And if we had those ideas get more prominence, we would not have people getting all confused about what the Holocaust is.
So now we're getting to the end of the hour, and I'd like to invite each of you to make some final remarks. So Jud, let's start with you, please.
Oh, I didn't even think of what my final remarks would be, but now I'll just spontaneously come up with some,
They
which,
could be the next to the final,
okay. What I want to say is I want to talk about current events. We are all dealing with, well, Jews and their allies, but Jews especially, are dealing with the trauma of October 7th. It was I don't have to tell anyone here that it was gleeful, fanatical butchery of the worst kind, the most disgusting kind. Right after that, turning on a dime, people in many parts of the world, in the United States and on campuses, immediately called Hamas our martyrs and said we have to justify what they did by asking, well, why did they do it? And that made me, of course, very uncomfortable and unhappy, but it continued and persisted. And I think it's important, therefore, that we remember that there is a difference between courage and the affirmation of life and terrorist and fanatical organizations that seem to have captured the imagination of much of the world, who are in fact fanatics. They seek martyrdom. They do not represent a future, a positive future or vision for their people, and are only there to establish oppressive, in this case, Islamic regimes where women are oppressed, there's no civil rights, gays are murdered, and to amass power and money. So I want people to remember that there is a difference between courage and fanaticism, and we have to make that clear to anybody who doesn't understand it. That's my last thought.
Shula, the last word goes to you.
Oh my God. Well, I don't want to toot my own horn, but I want to say that I just finished writing a book called Hiding in Holland. And it's published by Amsterdam Publishers, which is a press in Amsterdam that publishes the stories of people in the Holocaust, written primarily by their children and grandchildren. And it gets very close to, what happened there. And it will, by reading my book and everybody else's, there's a lot of other wonderful books there. You learn a lot of interesting things. For instance, there was something called the Jewish Brigade. Does anyone know about the Jewish Brigade? The Jewish Brigade, great, was something that was formed by Chaim Weizmann, and it was an army of Jews that fought in Italy and in other places. Why don't we know about that as much as we do about, being killed? So remember, we have survived over 2,000 years. There needs to be an explanation. The explanation is that we resisted. Everyone resists who wants to live. You know, some people resisted by killing themselves. There was a lot of suicide too. But and you should think about how you would resist. My father taught me as I was growing up that there are good people in this world. He didn't say, like Anne Frank, that there's something good in everyone. He said there are good people in this world. Find them. And he found one across the street from us, a Roman Catholic guy with 5 kids. And he said, Shula, when you need to hide, because he thought the Holocaust would recur, you go to Jack Smith. And I thought that was completely normal to say, because we need to survive. How are we going to do it? That's why we need to support Israel too. So we have to recognize that we all need to resist, and we all need to remember at the same time, and not one or other. Thank you.
Gosh, what an empowering program, and one I'll remember for a long time. So thank you, Dr. Shulamit Reinhardt. Thank you, Dr. Jud Newborn. Thanks to our audience, and come join us again next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone. Be well. Bye-bye. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.